So I wanted to first thank Christine for the invitation. Thank Christina for the wonderful last 24-hour sort of tour and rapid-fire meetings, being put in the hot seat. There's nothing like having a $200 million building plus looming to get people to start paying attention to what you're going to do with it. And of course, no responsibility on my part that I have to sort of help you kick off things. So I better really do a good job of making sure I live up to what the title talks about, which is Space Matters. So just for clarification, I want to add one word to this title that I think is really going to make a difference. And just logistically, I want to tell you that I'm not going to stand on the dais here. I am going to move around. I can't possibly sit behind a podium for very long. Maybe it's my mental health problems, but I don't think so. I think what I like to do is I like to interact with people. And actually, the reason why I've stepped off this podium to move here, there's a research-based evidence reason why I am doing that. And I'm going to talk about that as we go forward. So I'm going to add one word. And the one word I'm going to add to the title is supporting active learning anywhere, okay? And I think that's a really important clarification because you can do active learning anywhere, okay? There are rooms that help you do it, and there are rooms that make it harder for you to do it. And I think that's one of the key things that I want to start on, because that's going to really start our sort of journey through the day. But before we get there, I just want to give you a little bit of background. You already aced that, McGill is in Montreal and in Canada. So right there, you're a step above many people. This is great. I'm so happy you know that where we're from. I hope you've ever been. It's a great place to go. This is the iconic sort of view of McGill University, sort of the front steps of our arts building as you walk in. This is usually what people assume McGill is like. The joke, of course, at McGill is Montreal has two seasons, fire and ice. That's it. If you go in the middle of the summer, it's infernally hot. It's like 100 plus degrees. And if you go in the winter, it's very often, 20 below zero. And after talking with Christina, know that you guys have some similar temperature swings, but not nearly as much snow. We are a worldwide known city for being able to remove snow and move it around from one place to the other. And we don't ever have snow days. It's almost impossible. It's very rare that this sort of thing happens. But I want to give you a little bit of background because I think there are a lot of similarities between Minnesota and McGill. As you may or may not know, McGill, we're an R1 research institution. We are very, very heavily research focused. And we're public, of course, because all Canadian universities are publicly funded. Our tuition runs from, if you're from Quebec, about $4,000 a year. If you're from Canada, about $8,000, and if you're from the United States, about $16,000. So we're basically, on the end of not having a lot of funding. So I just want to clarify all of that, because a lot of people look at classrooms, and I once went and heard the term, oh, well, yeah, but you rich Canadians have great spaces. And I said, well, on what planet did you grew up on? Rich Canadians? Nobody has ever put those two words together. But what I do want to mention with the university that kind of gives you a bit of an idea of where we're coming from, we have 35,000 students from 120 countries. This actually is a couple of years old in the stats. We're closer to 40,000 now. We're still a lot smaller than you guys, but we do have a large number of students, and we're a very diverse student body from all over the world. About 1,700 tenure-track faculty, 3,400 admin. We have around 475 classrooms, we think. Nobody is really sure, because like all large universities, and I'm sure you are too, it depends on which unit you ask what number is correct. We might have somewhere around 475 and around 21,000 seats that we have to deal with. And a particularly interesting problem that we have is we're 190 years old, 1821. So we have a heritage campus. We have everything from beautiful, wonderful old architecture to horrifying 60s brutalist buildings to bright and modern 1990s kind of style buildings as well. But as a result of that heritage campus, we have something called a deferred maintenance debt. And anybody who knows anything about construction or has ever known anything about their city or anything like that, deferred maintenance is basically stuff you should have been taken care of, but you didn't. Now, there might be good reasons for that, but what that means is that there's an enormous amount of things that we have to renovate when we deal with our campus. And so classrooms, when you start looking at that number, don't necessarily seem to be the top of the list. I mean, we do need to worry about breathing, right? I mean, and one of the jokes that I've often done when talking with students and with their parents is, at McGill, we value breathing. We really do. We think is important for learning. And although that is a joke, one of the most important things is the precursors. Is like, if you can't breathe, how are you supposed to learn? Now, everybody thinks that's kind of silly and kind of funny, but I'll give you a real life example of this. We're renovating a classroom that has 100 seats in it. Had 100 seats in it for quite some time. We go to start talking with the engineers. They start doing an analysis, and it turns out that the ventilation was pumping enough air for around 60 people. So how many years have we been pumping this classroom with 60 people's worth of air and putting 100 people in it, and then wondering why students are a little bit tired, they might be dozing off? We're actually killing them, slowly. So I think we'd have to be very aware that there are some really basic core things that we avoid and that we have not done at our universities, and we are doing a huge disservice to our students because of that, okay? Now, so our journey today, there's going to be basically 3 parts of this journey. The first part is looking at what we know about learning, because there are some things we do know about learning in terms of the field of education. And the second is really think about why space matters and what that means in terms of teaching and learning. And lastly, talk about, well, how do we support active learning anywhere? How do we get to this level where faculty can take advantage of these wonderful new spaces? So, one of the interesting things about evidence is how much at universities we love to ignore it. And it's really, really interesting where, you know, when you talk to anybody about research in the field, it's very, very easy that you look up all these wonderful seminal articles, all this research has been done, we've made all these decisions, all these conclusions, but then you start talking about teaching and learning research and goes, well, that may have worked for them, but we need to research it ourselves to really know whether or not it's true. Which is interesting that we have this dichotomy that when it comes to teaching and learning, we have a much higher bar of accepting evidence than we do our own research, which is kind of an interesting thing to think through. So I want to think about, well, what do we know about learning? And what can we do in terms of summarizing everything that we know about the entire field in like 3 or 4 bullet points? Well, to start that, I want to throw something out at you. So give me a word that says, like, I learn best when X. Finish the sentence. I learn best when I'm engaged. I learn best when I'm making something. I learn best when I'm doing the skill that I'm talking about. What else? When I know the context. Making connections. Teaching. How about somebody online? Anybody online want to throw one in? When it's interesting. Okay. So, interestingly, none of you said, I learn best when I'm in a lecture hall listening to some expert talk about a particular piece of information that I'm supposed to know. But, and I'm saying that a bit facetiously, because there are things we're doing right now, we're doing a lecture right now, and I think we have to be aware that there's nothing wrong with the methodology itself, but we have to think about why we're doing it and when we're doing it and what it's for. So, to sort of do the quick summary from that, I mean, we know that learners create knowledge actively and uniquely inside their own head. So we know that students are creating knowledge inside their brains at all times. We are as well. And we know that students learn best when they experience course content in multiple modalities. So we know that you can't just say something, you need to support it with some visuals, you need to have some experiences that go along with it. The more modalities we add to a particular learning experience, the more likely you are to learn it. Now, I want to be very, very careful. This has nothing to do with preference, okay? The idea of learning styles, which keeps coming up, we need to do this because students' learning styles are different, and everybody learns this way or that way, and that's not true at all. Okay, there is absolutely no evidence for learning styles. They do not exist at all. There's no evidence for them in the literature. And even if there were evidence, anything that they've looked at, there's the idea of saying, you're an auditory learner, so I have to teach you this way to make you learn better. No evidence whatsoever. The reason, though, that we want those multiple modalities is not because people like to learn because somebody's talking to them, but that we want to have as many opportunities as possible to learn something. And sometimes you might hear something, but not really understand something until you see the visuals attached. And then actually when you experience it, it cements it even farther. So the more modalities, the better. Second, we need to know that learners learn best when they connect new knowledge to existing knowledge. We, as a faculty members, have to help students up the staircase. That's basically what we do. We build on things that have come in the past. We make connections to previous courses. We make connections to their life. We want to make sure that all of those things are connected together so that it's a progress forward. The third, we know that in order to learn, you have to focus attention on the learning experience. This goes to the wonderful other myth, which is the myth of the multitasker. Now, how many people well, if you have kids, I have 3 kids, how many people have you had kids or have students that said, oh, no, I can do all these things at the same time because I'm a really good multitasker? Doesn't exist. No such thing as multitasking. Our brains do not multitask. We are not multitasking humans. We cannot do that. And the one way to really look at this is if you Google online any of these wonderful videos about people texting and writing and then falling into fountains as they walk, you can know that we cannot do multiple things at the same time. We can switch tasks very quickly, so we can do 2 things. It seems like we're doing 2 things at once. But what we're doing is we're attuning our attention to one thing or another. We can only attend to one thing at a time. Which means if the student is in your class surfing Facebook, writing email, etc., while you're doing an activity, they are not engaged. Okay? And if the entire class is doing something else while you're teaching, it might give you an indication that engagement is a bit of an issue, and you need to figure out why are they doing that, as well as what kind of activities you're getting them to do. Fourth, motivation is the precursor for everything. We need to make sure students are motivated to learn. Motivation can come in lots of different ways. It can be, you're going to get graded on this. And can also be, ideally, the more internal, the better, the concept that we want students to be able to strive to learn this information because they need to know this information. But one of the things about motivation is we have to give students the opportunity to be motivated. We have to show them the connections. This is why this is important. You know this crazy, stupid fact I'm talking about right now? There's a reason why this is important. Or, guess what? I had a patient the other day, and this is why this is exactly relevant. Well, there's a reason why students love those stories, is because it allows them to make those connections. Feedback. One of the few things we really do know in education, the closer the feedback is to the event of the learning, the more likely you are to learn. Which is why if you're going to do any sort of intervention with a student and a patient, it's best to do it right after they met with the patient than, let's say, 3 days later. Oh, by the way, the person you saw on Tuesday, you kind of did a whole bunch of things wrong, right? That doesn't work. We know it doesn't work as well. And one of the things that is a result of this feedback is a great example of why students cry in your office after the first midterm. So why are they crying in your office after the first midterm? Because they've never had feedback until the midterm. And then they get that feedback and go, oh my goodness, everything I'm doing is wrong. I studied the wrong things. I really had no idea, and now I'm in trouble. So we need to give them opportunities to get that feedback early and often, as much as possible. And last, of course, they need to work on engaging collaborative, authentic experiences. There's nothing worse in learning about medicine than spending your time reading something from a book as opposed to actually hearing from what's happening with the patient. And there's a reason why a lot of the ideas around problem-based learning focus on patients and cases as opposed to just learning the facts first. And so I think that's another sort of piece that we have to keep thinking about engaging collaborative, authentic experiences. So we know all of this stuff about learning. But I think one thing that's come up as a word that's frequent and sort of, I guess you'd call it the buzzword that's currently rippling through universities is active learning. And I guess one of the things that we need to do in order to unpack that is think what active learning is. So here's a great definition of active learning that I think is really interesting to think about. Now, active learning can involve jumping jacks and running around the room, but that's not exactly the idea around active that we're talking about here. What we're talking about is ensuring that the mind is actively engaged. Okay? Now, if the mind is actively engaged, that means students can do active learning in lots of different ways. Active learning does not require speaking. It does not require students talking to each other. You can be actively engaged with content. You could actually, note-taking is a great example of an active learning process. You're reading something, you're picking out important ideas, you're, let's say, drawing a concept map from the notes that you have, or summarizing activities. Those are active learning strategies. So I think we have to be careful not to conflate active learning with talking all the time. That's not what we necessarily mean with active learning. And the second part, though, here is that students are dynamic participants in their learning, the second part of the 3. Active learning requires students to make decisions and be engaged. They bear a responsibility in this process. You cannot do active learning if the students don't want to do it, right? Which is what we sort of run into problems of, where if, let's say, we want to do a task and then nobody at the table wants to engage, you've got an issue. So I think this is an important piece, is that we have to actually talk with our students and help them understand that, teaching is not done to you. You're not just a passive recipient in this where you sit there and just absorb everything and you don't have to work. There's a lot of work involved in learning, and you have to engage in that process. And so we have to make students aware that this is not a type of class, this is not a type of activity where you're going to sit there and do nothing and study it all later. We're going to learn now. And in order to learn now, we have to work at it. The third part here is the reflecting on and monitoring the process and the results of the learning. So it's not just enough to do the work, but you have to stop for a minute and think about, what have I done, and why am I doing it, and why is it relevant? So that reflection process that has to occur. So all of these things we need to think about when we're designing active learning opportunities for students. But usually what comes up right after that is, well, wait a minute. I went to medical school, and I learned a particular way, and I'm fine. So why do I have to change anything? Because, I mean, we did lectures, all we had was lectures, and then we had patients, and then we learned on the wards, and everything was okay. Why do we possibly have to worry about this? And I think there's two answers to this. One is because there's evidence that it's much more effective to do a different way. But the second thing we have to remember is a lot of the time is, as faculty members, most of our students are not us. They're not going to be us. Faculty members are generally the exception, not the rule, of the graduating group. Most of the students that are, say, in medical school that you're dealing with are going to go on to become doctors. They may never teach at a university, may never decide to have a research portfolio, et cetera. And that's an important distinction, that the faculty members, we often think that we are replicating ourselves in our students, and we're not. We have to be careful of that. But there is an enormous amount of evidence, and I think I want to just point to 4 particular articles that I think are useful to think about active learning as a strategy and why active learning can be so successful. The first one is a study from Richard Hackey from Indiana back in the late 80s that talked about looking at physics and looking at 2 different methodologies in terms of success in physics. Now, one of the nice things that physics has something called a force concept inventory. And it's a really, really cool assessment that basically measures the amount of physics knowledge you have without necessarily talking about physics or having you do equations. So what they're able to do with the force concept inventory is basically assess a group of students before, let's say, a course, and then assess them after a course. And they can look at these conceptual changes. A lot of them are around, okay, if I spin a ball on a string around my head and I let go, which direction is it going to go? Or if I drop a feather and a bowling ball at the same height and I let go, are they moving at the same speed or not? These are sort of concepts in physics about gravity, about acceleration, things that if you know a little bit about physics, you might be able to answer. And so what they found very clearly is that students in courses with interactive engagement had a gain of 2 standard deviations higher than the traditional methodology of lecturing. Straight up. 2 deviations higher, across the board. And this is with thousands of students that they were looking at. The N is 6,500 students they were looking at. Okay, that's one small example. Here's the example that we have here, is the active learning had the biggest gains, and this is sort of the details about the average class scores, and looking at the different groups of college and high school, whether they were doing things actively or not actively. The normalized gain being 100%, there's an example there. Another example here is if you're looking for a really great overview research article on active learning is Does Active Learning Work? A review by Michael Prince. He's actually an engineer, and this is published in an engineering Department of Chemical Engineering, and this is actually in an engineering journal. And what he did was he looked at all the different types of active learning out there, so problem-based learning and collaborative learning and all the wonderful buzzword names, and basically looked at there is across the board evidence in almost every situation that active learning was better in terms of promoting the outcomes than traditional kind of approaches, i.e. just a lecture, okay? An important thing to keep in mind. So again, another example there with a huge amount of studies that he looked at. A third one, and one of my favorites, is by Joel Michael, who did something, he's actually a physiologist, and looked at where the evidence for active learning was. And basically came again to the same sort of conclusion, looking at all the studies that they were examining about the enormous wealth of research supporting the benefits of active learning. And one of the really fun things that he talked about in this article is said, you know, if this was in medicine, and we were talking about drug effectiveness, we would have stopped researching this about 15 years ago. We way surpassed the evidence that exists that it can actually get better outcomes. But we just keep doing it over and redoing it over and redoing it over. And the last one, which I want to point to, which is an enormous sort of meta study that looks at STEM courses in 2014 that talks about active learning across science, engineering, and math as examples. Looked at what is particularly interesting is that students in traditional lecture courses were 1.5 times more likely to fail compared to students in courses with heavy active learning components. And that the active learning classes outperformed those in the identical exams at least a standard deviation higher. So this is looking at, again, at thousands and thousands of students. And what seems to be interesting is when you start really looking deeply at this evidence when it comes to active learning and lecturing, it's not the top end students that are really receiving the best benefit. So the students that are at the high end of the curve tend to be at the high end of the curve despite the teaching we do to them. In other words, they're really great. They're at the top end, and if we lecture at them or do active learning, they do well just about anything. They're almost impervious to teaching, which is kind of interesting. Whereas what's interesting when you look at a lot of the active learning studies that look at the strategies, it's actually the bottom part, the bottom half that is moved significantly up. Failure rates are significantly lower, especially minority students. So there's lots of evidence that it's actually helping at the bottom pulling up than it is necessary at the top pulling up. So that's something to keep in mind, and there's a lot of evidence around that we can keep looking at. If we want some more, let's throw a bit more at it. We have improved student understanding, improved student retention in general student population to underrepresented minorities, as I said, attitudes, problem-solving skills. We have perceptions and attitudes towards information literacy. We have increased enthusiasm, increased content knowledge, graduate capabilities, and critical thinking. There is an enormous amount of evidence here, okay? And if we wish to ignore it, we can't say it's because you have to prove it to me, okay? Now, the best way, or one of my favorite words to sentences to summarize this whole literature up in one sentence is by Doyle, and talks about the one who does the work does the learning. Basically, if you spend all of this time preparing the seminal lecture, you've gone through an enormous amount of work to prepare your slides, prepare the materials, get everything ready, and then you deliver that perfect experience. You have done all the work, and you do all the learning. What we need to do is at every moment, at every stage, is how can I stop giving the students an information? How can I get them to do the work? How can I get them to help figure it out? And that's a great way to think about it, because if you keep reflecting back on that every time you prepare something, going, well, instead of just telling them this, can I get them a way to figure it out themselves? They're going to learn it better. End of story. And the other part here that I want to really stress is that active learning isn't a magical wand either. And this is the other problem that we have to think about, is that just saying, oh, okay, I've implemented active learning, I wave my wand, everything is fabulous. It occurs when the teacher creates the learning environment that is more likely to occur. Everything we do in education is a hope. We sort of create conditions so that something will happen. We create great conditions in the classroom, we give great opportunities to students. Students have to take the initiative to move forward in order to make sure that we're able to achieve the outcomes we want to achieve. Now, I want to point out one of the famous sort of seminal 1400 picture by Laurentis of the lecture. And I want to point out a couple of interesting things here. Even in the 1400s, there are some people in the audience I want to point out to keep an eye on about the types of things that were happening in the classroom. If you look at the top right, is a really good example. The top right, we've got three people that are basically talking, kind of not listening to what's going on. They're kind of distracted. So the people in the top right are kind of distracted. The person, right in the middle there on the top, is basically sort of falling asleep. Not really, sort of hand like this, kind of like, sort of snoring off a little bit here. On the bottom left here, this person on the right is looking at the other person's notes. I think they probably are cheating. They may have forgotten their tools. Maybe they forgot their technology for the day. Some other of these poor folks seems to have forgotten their books and scribes entirely and are totally out of the loop. And this guy in the bottom right-hand corner has just given up. So the interesting point is that, the issues that we're talking about when it comes to the lecture hall and lecturing are no different from 1400 than they are now. And I want to sort of throw something out at you too, is that I would propose that the lecture is the aberrant of educational approaches. The lecture is the exception. And the reason why I'd say that is about the following. If you look at before the printing press about how people taught each other, nobody sat there and lectured to each other. Everybody did things. You had apprenticeships. You worked. A blacksmith didn't read about how to become a blacksmith. A blacksmith worked with another blacksmith and learned how to be a blacksmith. You wanted to be a physician, you worked with another physician and they taught you how to be a physician. End of story. Lecturing really started to show up when the printing press showed up, because suddenly a certain number of people had knowledge that the others didn't. And the lectures of old were literally reading through the books. I'm going to read you something that you don't know and you can't do on your own. I'm going to read this to you. And so that's what was happening. And then, of course, after that as well, the other big pump or increase in lecturing is because people wanted to deal with learning at scale. So behaviorism in the 50s, and suddenly the idea that in a university we could have lots of people in a room and be able to sort of streamline that process. But when you look at all of history, lecturing is a very small piece of it. And I think we have to remember that, because the idea that active learning that we're talking about is not new. It is not out of the blue. It has lots of evidence, and it's really a return to the types of learning that we used to do as a society, as opposed to this new format, this crazy new format of lecturing, which is really young and unproven. So I think we need to think that through, and I'm being a little facetious, but I want to point that out to you. But what does it mean? Does it mean that lecturing is dead and we should never lecture anymore? No. What we're talking about is balance. What we're talking about is lecturing for that's something that's really important to do. You can do as a lecturer. You can do some things as a lecturer, and then other things you want to do more actively. So a good example, if you want to provide either motivation or a large amount of material in a short period of time, a lecture is a great thing to do. Now, doing it for 3 hours is a whole different story. But if you're taking something like a lecture and you're using it in small pieces where maybe you overview of something for 10 minutes and then have an activity for 5 minutes and then go back to a lecture maybe for 5 minutes and an activity for 5 minutes, you're finally getting that cycle where here's what I'm telling you, okay, about a cell, da-da-da-da. Now here's a case that's directly applicable. Let's talk about it for a second. Talk to your neighbor, etc. So it's that idea that we're appealing to the way the brain works, we're appealing to the way that we know learning works, and we're able to rebalance the situation. Because I'm not saying that lecturing is bad, but always lecturing is bad. Okay? And even with active learning, there are certain things that are very difficult to do in a highly interactive, active way, as an example. So for example, if I'm teaching you, let's say, how to do compressions, heart compressions as an example, what I don't want you to do is figure it out for yourself. I don't want you to discuss it with your neighbor. I don't want you to come up with a new way of doing compressions. I'm saying, this is how you do compressions. I'm going to do it. You do it exactly the same way. So that's the same idea as an example. There are some things that you need to be told. There are some knowledge that you need to know, but we don't want to do everything that way. So now that we've got that idea, that first part out of the way, that we know active learning is something that we want to do, or we know that something is we should do, or at least do more than we're currently doing now, then we have to think about space, because you have a unique opportunity that very few places have, where you have this phenomenal brand new facility that's going to go online, that's going to allow you to do all sorts of interesting things. And so the question, though, is in that process is, well, what's the evidence that changing our space does anything in the first place anyways? I mean, we've been teaching this way in rooms like this forever, or at least seems to be forever. Why do we have to change it? Why can't we create a bunch more lecture halls and off we go? So I think in order to think that through, we have to start at the beginning and think about something called the built environment. Everything we do and every place we interact is a built environment. What it means is that someone came up with the idea of the space that you're standing in or doing and had a particular intent and design about how you were supposed to behave in it. That's what architects do. Architects design experiences. And anybody who's ever been in different sort of art museums is a good example, know that there's careful care taken to exactly how you're supposed to experience that particular space. And our campus is no different than that. Our campus is designed a specific way. Here's the path you're going to take. Here's the door you're going to take. Here's the way that you're going to come in the classroom. Here's where you're going to sit. Now, mostly what I'm talking about is the formal learning spaces idea. So informal learning spaces, i.e. where students are kind of on their own, working on their own, that's not really what I'm talking about right now, but a lot of the ideas and the principles apply to that. What I'm really talking about is these formal learning spaces, classrooms or teaching labs, where people are getting together to at least with some sort of agreement about what they're going to do and working on those ideas and working on that kind of learning. So there are three things about space I want to talk about. One is space impacts perception and space impacts performance. And as well, I'll get to a couple of other things as well related to space. But the first thing I want to mention is that space, we know, impacts our perception. We can change the space and change your perceptions within that space. A good example is here is a room that looks like it doesn't have a floor. This is designing the space to give you an experience of no floor, as an example, or give you an idea that there is a river that you're flowing down when there really isn't. So you can change the environment and impact your own perception. Another great example of this is a building that looks like it doesn't have a corner. It's designed almost as an optical illusion to give you the sense that you can almost see through the building because of the way it's mirrored. Now, take a look at that for a second and tell me, how many people see it moving? Okay. Now, I can assure you it's not moving, but our brain is interpreting this particular slide as having moving dots on it. So our brain's filling in sort of things behind the scenes, knowing that we can do things to make your brain perceive things differently. It's kind of creepy when you think about it, that you can change things around your experience to change your own experience in that environment. Straight lines or crooked lines? Straight lines. They look crooked, but they're not. Same sized orange circle or different sized orange circle? Same? Yeah. So you know the tricks. You probably have done those perception courses and studied psychology and got all these wonderful little illusions. But it's amazing how easily we can trick the brain into thinking something else when it's not in fact the case. My favorite one is this one, is what's color of the dress? Now, I don't know if any of you got caught up in this wonderful internet meme, but this was like an enormous internet war that started over the color of that dress, with people analyzing pixels and arguing. It's either white and gold or blue and black. Okay, so blue and black or white and gold. I can only see gold and white. I cannot see blue and black, but people tell me they can see blue and black. All right? So there you go. So you can see blue and black. I see just white and gold. And what's really interesting is that we're both looking at the same dress, okay, perceiving something totally different. Now, when you think about that perception and what sort of simple things like light and color can do to your experience, you don't have to look very far to look at the research of the impact on learning of that. Now, if any of you have kids, you probably have heard of the horrors of blue light, right? The horrors of blue light, like don't use your iPad before bed, you're going to be up for 3 hours, and da-da-da, right? This is the word. And what's really interesting is that there's absolute evidence that this is the case. Blue light, it comes from a particular spectrum that activates your brain. It messes up your circadian rhythms, which is why if you're reading an iPad that has that bright blue light, it will actually wake you up and get you excited right before bed. So that's why they have the night shift on all the phones, and that's why they tell you to try not to use a computer right before bed as an example. But what they've actually done is some interesting studies about looking at blue light enriched classrooms. So this is giving classrooms and lights in the classrooms the opportunity to change the hue and intensity about what kind of color the lights are emitting. So by using actually blue light to the advantage of learning, so saying, well, in the afternoon at 3 o'clock, we're going to crank up the blue light to get people to sort of be a little bit more active. And it turns out there's absolutely evidence for this. So in other words, what they found is that beneficial effects of blue-enriched white light on students' performance, so that students were faster cognitively by changing the light that they were have access to. So there's no question that space and color and lights and the environment can have an impact on the learning process that we have. This is just one example when you're talking about lighting. So the lighting that's being chosen by the architect, you should have a thought about what kind of lights and who controls the lights and how can I turn certain ones on and certain ones off and how can I change the lights to support the learning I want to do if I'm going to do a particular activity. What kind of color of lights do we have? Things like that. The second is space impacting interaction. And this is the research evidence for why I hopped off the dais as a good example. So there's a really interesting area called proxemics. And what proxemics talks about is the connection between the distance between people and the types of interactions that they have. So for example, the 12 foot to 25 foot. So if the person on the left, the blue person on the left might be me. 12 foot to 25 feet puts people in a public space. So once we get past maybe the 4th row onwards, you're all in a public space. I can't really see your eyes. I have a trouble looking at your facial reactions. Are you angry with me? Are you not paying attention? Or is something wrong? Or are you bored? Or are you excited? I really have no idea. And the idea that the public space, I'm in a performance mode. I'm performing regardless of what you do. You have almost no interaction with me. And it's very, very hard. Other than standing up and leaving, I really can't figure out what you're interested in or what you're doing. The next chunk here is this social space, and this is the 4 feet to 12 foot. So within that 4 feet to 12 feet, I can see your eyes, I can see if you're looking at me, you might have a little twitch of confusion, I can tap into that. Suddenly I have a lot more feedback as an instructor about what's going on. Likewise as students, if you're within that 4 foot to 12 foot range, how important that is to be able to get feedback from each other. Then we have the personal space. And this is, when you get a lot closer. So you might be within that sort of bubble, you can start to see people sweat maybe a little bit. So maybe they're a little bit more concerned about why are you so close? This is a keynote, you're not supposed to be near me. But but that personal space, it's the difference of the dinner table. Why do we not have a dinner table that's 30 feet long? We have a dinner table that's small. It's within that 1.5 to 4 foot sort of connection. Now, intimate space, we hope we're not involved in intimate space in a classroom, but just to give you an idea, the intimate space, you get things like pheromones, body heat, stuff that is a lot different in terms of feedback from people. Now, what's really interesting is if we look at our classrooms, is how many classrooms students are in the 12 foot to 25 foot space. They're in the public space. They're so far away, you can't tell at all what they're looking at, what they're feeling, what they're interested in. You might have a balcony where they're in the way back. You can never get to them if you wanted to. It's also why you want to move. The cameraman's going to kill me. Why you want to move and move around that room to be able to get closer to people to make that kind of contact. And there's a very different experience when someone's talking from 25 feet away and when someone gets kind of inside your personal space as if right next to you. You sort of get that, whoa. And it allows for engagement, it allows for attention, and changes a whole bunch of focus. So I think we need to think about this when we design our classrooms, because how can we design our classrooms so no student is any more than 12 feet away? Ooh, now that's a good challenge, and that's something we have to think about. One of my favorite ones I'm going to show you is space impacting behavior. So here we go. About that for a second, that 66% of people changed their behavior based on one small little change. They made the stairs more fun, and they made the stairs more interactive. Now, if we take that concept again and apply that to the design of our classrooms, how can we have our classrooms be more interactive, more engaging? And if we change the environment, we can have an impact and change our behavior, as an example. So that's just one small example of how you can shift people's behavior around and having a real outcome. We're getting people to actually move. So we're helping, health outcomes in the process, as an example. Now, one of my other favorite ones is Winston Churchill, and everybody loves Winston Churchill. It's just a great shot of him. But I want to talk briefly about Winston Churchill and what happened in the 1940s. So when the house was destroyed, Winston Churchill rebuilt the house and did a couple of interesting things in that house, and I want to explain what he did, which was critical. One is he created two very distinct sides of the house with a very, very big gap in the middle. That's one thing he did. And the other thing he did was he built the house with less seats than representatives. So he built the house too small. And always on purpose. So what do you think might be an interesting reason why? Why do you think he built two sides with a gap in the middle? Encouraging debate. Not only did he do it to encourage debate, but he encouraged to make sure that if you changed sides for a discussion, you had to get up, walk across the middle. Everybody saw you and sit down on the other side. So you had to really decide that you were going to change your stance from one party to the other in the discussion by moving from one side to the other. The other is, why do you think he made it smaller? Show up on time. Okay, that's a good example. Mingle, okay. He did it to create a sense of urgency. What he didn't want is people comfortably sitting debating for 10 hours. What he wanted is people uncomfortable, standing, hot, deciding to make the decision now, do it, move forward. He wanted to create that sort of sense of urgency around the people that were there, which is, I think, a really important, interesting twist. So he used architecture to change behavior within the house. And I think that's the same kind of idea. Again, examples where we can take examples that are already existing, that have already been done, and start applying them to education. How can we shape behavior based on the environments that we provide? And a good example is, well, what message do you think this classroom sends to a student? Uncomfortable. This is one of our classrooms that we renovated. One source of knowledge. You better be right-handed. That's right. Otherwise, you're out. Forget it. We don't need any of those left-handed people here, right?
No room for other sources like a laptop.
No room for anything. Yeah, that's true.
Sit in your spot and don't move.
Sit in your spot and don't move. So the space is communicating an attitude and behavior for the people that walk into it. The minute a student walks into a space like that, the space communicates to them that, one, you're supposed to sit down, take notes, be quiet, don't talk to each other, move on. Right? And it communicates to a faculty member that your job is to stand up front and tell them things, because that's what it's designed behind this Volkswagen-sized podium as well. That keeps a huge, nice distance between you, the prefect, and the students in the audience. So we have to keep that in mind that, space creates expectations of behavior, it suggests how people should act, and communicates what is valued. These are critical things we have to think about and take advantage of. This is one of my favorite pictures. We have a 600-seat lecture hall on our campus, and this is a shot of a student that I took unbeknownst to them, which is great because their face is the other way, so you can't tell who it is. But if you notice, this student is sitting in our largest lecture hall. His feet don't fit on the tier. His feet are dangling to the next tier. His knees are right up against the edge of the seat in front, and he's not even using the stupid little tablet. He actually has his laptop in his lap because it won't fit. The real question is, what are we doing? It's almost as if we've intentionally set up our spaces to create all of the conditions possible for learning not to happen, and then expect the faculty member to walk into them and have magic occur. Everything you're doing in these spaces, you're overcoming all of these horrors and limitations that are placed in front of you as a faculty member and trying to get learning to happen. And there's a reason why it's hard. And it's hard because it's not designed for it. And I think this is one of those things where this is like the grumpy cat is extremely unhappy. Very, very grumpy with this kind of layout. This is not what we want to do. This is not the type of learning we want to support. And I don't think anybody would want a student to be sitting for 6 hours, or let's say 4 out of 5 of their classes, in a room like that all the time. So what I want to sort of lead to the end of this part with you is the idea that we have to keep in mind that our built campus is communicating a vision of teaching and learning to our students and everybody on it. So what we value is coming out in the way that the campus is built. And that is an important piece because the building that you're going to get is going to communicate something to people. And you have to make sure, is it communicating what we want it to be communicating? And that's an important part of the process. So what can we do? Mostly as faculty members, we're just forced to teach in one place or another. We don't really have a choice in it. We can't really say, I'd really like to have something better. Not too bad, you have 250 students is the only place on campus you can go enjoy. But there are some things that we can do to take advantage of our spaces. And I'd like to propose a couple of things. In order to support active learning anywhere, we have to do kind of 4 big major things. The first is we have to create governance. Okay, we need governance and we need input from all the stakeholders involved about the types of spaces we want and the types of spaces we want to have built at our institutions. The second, we want to design our classrooms by pedagogical principles. We don't want to start off a design going, we need to fit 50 people. Let's figure out how to compromise every principle we have so we can stuff 50 people into there. Number of students in a room should not be our final decision point. We have to really think that through. Third is we need to create spaces for active learning anywhere. It isn't realistic to think that we're going to have active learning classrooms everywhere on campus, and we probably shouldn't either. What we really need to start doing is thinking of having diverse learning environments. How can we have lots of options? So you can decide, for this class it'd be really great if I was in a little bit larger space, or in this class it'd be really great if I was in an active learning classroom, or this class, you know what, I just want to have it in a laboratory. I don't even want to have it in a classroom, as an example. And then last, we need to design comprehensive faculty development programs so that we can make sure that faculty are ready to take advantage of these wonderful new spaces and new buildings that we're providing. So let's dive in a little bit deeper about what I mean by these governance areas, and all of them actually. So in terms of governance, at McGill, about 10 years ago, we created the provost basically took all of the funding that was being given out to all the schools, took it away from all of them, put it into a pile, and said, okay, all renovations to all classroom spaces are going to come from this fund, this one group, turned to our teaching and learning unit and said, guess what? You're now in charge of that. Now, this was one of those moments of, oh boy, this could be an opportunity. And this could be an opportunity to think about what kinds of classrooms we were going to build. And this particular learning spaces working group and a future teaching lab working group, which is doing the same thing, created a mandate or for a vision for teaching and learning space development, creating standards and sound pedagogical principles, and ultimately was designed and set up to steward funding for all classrooms and subsequently all teaching labs that are built on campus. So I chair both of these two committees. I have been for a number of years as well. And these are really, really interesting groups. And they're interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that everybody is there. These committees have 40, 45 plus people on them. We have representatives from every faculty. We have representatives from every school. We have representatives from IT, from architecture, from project management, from our registrar. All those people are all represented on these particular committees, which means that everybody has a stake at the table, including students. We have students, undergraduate and graduate there as well. And what we do with this every year is we go through a funding cycle. We get requests, we figure out what the best for the university is going to be, we recommend funding, the funding goes off, the classrooms are designed, then they're built, and then we start the cycle again. And we do this every single year by consensus. And most people don't believe me. You cannot believe me, that's fine. But we do have this these working groups, and they do work really well. And a lot of it has to do with the openness and the transparency that these working groups have, so that we're able to, instead of having, let's say, a facilities group design and fund and build an entire space, and then afterwards faculty come in and go, this is not what would be helpful for me. We have everybody sitting at the table all at the beginning and all the way through, so that those issues come up early. And when those issues come up early, they're easy to intervene and they're easier to discuss. The other thing we did is we focused on research-informed learning space design. We took everything we knew about architecture, education, and psychology research, a lot of what I talked to you about. We took the NSSE benchmarks, and the reason why we took the NSSE benchmarks is just because senior admin was using them. And sometimes it's a good reason to do anything. Because senior admin pays attention to it, it's a good reason to use those benchmarks. We could have used anything in terms of a research framework. When we used the NSSE benchmarks, and what we did is we basically built principles for the design of teaching and learning spaces, and we were able to map those principles directly to changes and modifications we do in our classrooms to support learning. I'll give you an example of these. So first, we want to have an academic challenge. We want learning spaces to allow students to actively engage with content and include a range of technologies to support multiple modes of teaching and learning. Students cannot engage with content if they have a tablet that's this big. To engage with content, they need to be able to use the tools at their disposal. A laptop, a book, a notebook. They might have to use all three of them. How could it possibly fit on a small little space? If we want students to engage, we need to be able to provide them with the tools in the space to be able to do that. Second is learning spaces should provide features that permit students to work both individually and in collaboration with each other. If you're in a theater seat and it's very, very hard to work with anybody around you, that's violating one of our principles. That's not what we want to support. We want to have the ability to be able to do that in any classroom that we have. Third, we want to make sure that faculty can facilitate communication and interaction between students and faculty. That means the dais with the wall behind the faculty, the faculty member is behind, where they can't get out into the students, is a serious problem. If we can't have students engage with faculty if they're protected behind a shield called a podium in the front. Lastly, we want to make sure that campus environment is consistent with our culture and priorities and reflective of the master plan, follows universal design standards where we can, ensures accessibility for all, etc., and is designed with flexibility. And we want to make sure that we're able to have transition spaces so that you can move from outside of the classroom to into the hallways to be able to support the type of learning that we want to have. And this translates into something directly applicable for teaching. Don't worry about the details, but I'm going to point out a few things. If we want to promote active engagement with content, then we want to make sure we have furniture that allows for different types of tasks and provides students with enough work surface to be able to work. Okay? Another good example with learning with peers. We want to make sure if we're going to have learning with peers, we have to have sound zones that support conversations. If it's really, if the room is only designed as a one-way sound zone, and that if you have conversations, nobody can hear anything because the acoustics are bouncing around like a yo-yo, that's a bit of a problem in the design, as an example. Last, we want students with remote interaction and communication. Well, we have to think about the podium not interfering with the sight lines and movement. Maybe having the podium in the front is not the best place to have it. Maybe we should have it in other locations. So what does this look like? In order to make that happen, take those design principles to turn them into action and into something concrete, we have to create spaces to support active learning anywhere. And to do that, I'm going to give you 5 different examples, or multiple examples in each one of these. But talking about active and collaborative lecture halls, I'm going to talk about active learning classrooms, active and collaborative teaching labs, prototyping spaces, and what I'm going to show you is the classroom of the future, or at least I'm going to suggest it's the classroom of the future. First, active and collaborative lecture halls. We all have lecture halls. In many cases, those lecture halls are not going to go away. They're often built, the entire building is built around them, and they're built in these giant cement tierings. So it's very, very hard to work with them. And in some cases, we're never going to turn them into an active learning classroom or a classroom with movable furniture, so we're stuck with them. And what's really interesting is when you have conversations with some of the furniture makers, you know, some of these big, wonderful furniture makers that are designing all of these wonderful lab spaces, they say, well, yeah, well, you shouldn't be using those. Like, are you kidding me? We're going to be using every inch of space on campus. We build classrooms and bathrooms if we can. I mean, anywhere we can get space, especially in an urban environment. But we know we have lecture halls. So what can we do to our lecture halls to make them better to support collaborative learning? And so here's some examples of that. So here's a basic example of a room that we built. This has about 184 seats. And this was a cement tier. We couldn't do much with this room. So we said, okay, we can't get tables. We can't be collaborative very well. What we could do is design seating that doesn't have arms, so it's at least easier to turn sideways to work with each other. And if you notice in front, the tablet doesn't come out from the arm and is not very small. It's a big, almost airplane-sized tablet that comes out in the front. So we basically increased the workspace by 3 times by going to furniture like this, as opposed to a furniture with a little sidearm. So again, super small change. This is not radical. This is not out of the blue. This is not totally crazy thinking. This is really just picking furniture that kind of supports the principles that we want to have. Collaboration, space to work. Here's another really interesting example from Iowa State, the LeBaron Hall Auditorium. So this has your traditional one-arm bandit kind of style layouts. But what's really interesting is that every other row is on a pivot. So it's very, very simple for students to go from, you know, front-facing lecture to collaboration by just spinning in place. So one row is fixed, one row spins, ta-da! Now we have the ability for students to work in teams in a giant lecture hall. 350 seats here, I think. 360 feet. Same sort of thing at University of Colorado, Denver. The Student Commons building has, again, that idea of one row fixed, one row rotating, so that you can actually have collaboration going on very, very easily in the space. Alumni Auditorium at the University of Exeter, each one of these seats is on a swivel pivot, so it can actually pivot around in 360 degrees. Again, another idea of lecture hall that can support collaboration. You could actually do a lecture in here and never collaborate. And in fact, some of the people that might do a lecture in here might never even know that you could collaborate. But the room supports it so that people that are stuck in a lecture hall that want to do some collaboration have the ability to do so. Here's an example of one of our 100-seat auditoriums or classrooms that we have. And again, what's simple here is 2 rows on a tier. Instead of putting 1 row in each tier, all you do is put 2 rows on a tier. 2 rows on a tier means you can turn around and you suddenly have a table that everybody can work at. Not brain surgery. Brain surgery is very different, and I'm sure there are some brain surgeons here that know that it's much more difficult to do brain surgery than it is to figure out that you can put 2 rows on a tier. And usually it doesn't actually cost you many seats at all. In fact, almost none. And it's a really simple fix that allows you to get at that kind of level. In addition here, we have all sorts of things like writable glass around the sides of the room, so you can actually sort of pile out to the outskirts and actually start writing on the walls on the sides. This room is multi-source projection, and one of the things that we did in this particular room, and this goes to the culture and the feel, is that the windows that are here on this, behind that screen in the back, it has natural light, which is great for a classroom, except the one problem of the natural light is it overlooks a ventilation system. So it's not that pretty. So what we did is we actually took a forest scene. This is actually a photograph from the mountain that is just maybe 50 feet sort of beyond the room, and put it on the back of the classroom. So it gives a different, interesting feel to it. You walk in and you feel sort of, oh, like there's a forest scene in the back. That's kind of neat. And you're still getting that natural light as an example. Here's a really interesting place if you haven't heard of it, Oregon State University. They have a 600-seat auditorium in the round. Now you might think, okay, that's kind of gimmicky. Why did they do that? I take one guess why they did that, and I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the proxemic argument. Exactly. The back row is no more than about 24, 25 feet from the center, which means the faculty member can get to the back row of this auditorium with maybe 5 or 6 steps, and you're there. So by the time you're around here, you're actually at the back of this 600-seat auditorium. It just happens to be in the round. Again, a really interesting way of designing a space. And they actually built this whole building with faculty collaborating with their facilities group to come up with these wild and interesting designs to do something different. So they have a 600-seat auditorium. Now, it's not as collaborative, I think, as you could be. You could have had some tables and maybe had some, chairs that you could spin or something like that. But the idea of actually using the research on proxemics to impact the design for a particular reason to get students and faculty more engaged with each other. Here's another shot of it as well. It's kind of interesting. It's almost like one of those domes that are there. Hine Hall at Indiana. What's interesting here is that there's a fixed row of seats and then a table directly behind the students are sitting at. So everybody in that front row can turn around and have a table instead of just a straight table. It's a nice little round table. There's writable surfaces around the whole room. There's the ability to do wireless screencasting. So what we have is a highly interactive and engaging lecture hall. Here's Greenlaw from the University of North Carolina. This is actually 6 pods. So it's a very large room of 100 seats with pods of sort of 20 or so, or 20 something, where it's almost like 6 movable classrooms that are connected to each other. So the faculty member walks up this middle row that's here and interacts with the groups of students that are in each one of the islands. And each island has its own color, and the students are in groups on those islands. Again, creative, interesting ways of having larger spaces so that you can move between collaboration and lecturing. This is University of Windsor School of Engineering with 350 student auditorium where students are on tables instead of rows and tiers. So they can work at a design team within a large 350 person environment and go back to a lecture if need be. Now we visited these and we took some of these ideas and we built our own version of this called, we call it an active learning lecture hall. It's a 96-seat auditorium where we have 4 tiers of 6 tables. And what's really interesting is you get these 6 tables that are shaped like light bulbs, and these tables, each one of these tables right directly behind the table is a whiteboard. So you get students that are able to collaborate in different groups, and you wouldn't think that this is a picture in our lecture hall, but this is a lecture hall. There's a forward facing, there's a front, as you can see here. There's actually video conferencing, and you can actually do sort of some communication with students or another room. But at the same time, being able to have students spin around, do work at a table together. And guess what? When we designed this auditorium, we didn't lose any seats when we went to a layout like this at all. Because whether we lay them in a row or lay them in a table, it was the same amount of people. So that's an interesting thing to think through, that we can make even our auditoriums more collaborative. And you actually have, I think, one of the designs is similar in the idea of a lecture hall that you can spin around and do collaborative work in. Active learning classrooms, I think many of you have seen these. So our first active learning classroom in 2009, again, the idea of round tables, the podium being in the middle, a lot more access between students and instructors, writable walls, projectable surfaces everywhere. In our case, we had these wonderful little colored glass panels that matched the table colors so that students knew that that was their part of the glass they could work with. So that was their area, their writable space. Other ones that we had in terms of collaborative labs, this is actually a GIS modeling course where the students are working, and the tables are shaped like banana boats. That's the best way to describe them. And they're curved so that students can see each other's screen really easily to collaborate with each other. And what's also interesting is that the monitors are cut into the tables so they go low. So they're not inside of people's faces, they're low enough that you can see over the top of all of them, almost like a big laptop, except these are super powerful desktop machines they're using for modeling. So again, that idea of promoting collaboration, writable walls all around the room, projectors everywhere, etc. Again, that theme coming up over and over. Another small active learning classroom, each student getting their own space to work in teams. Indiana University has a really interesting room here where each student pod that they have in their collaborative studio can project to the tiled screen at the front. What's nice about the tiled screen at the front, they weave together a bunch of flat screens. You could actually have, I think, all 16 tables can actually project at the same time. So you can look at 16 students in one big screen all at once. Another really cool twist that they've done on a lot of these active learning collaborative studio spaces. Of course, Briggs Hall, you have some of the most, some great spaces there from all sorts of different sizes to be able to do that kind of collaboration, writing around the room and projection for students. And the biggest one I've ever been in, which is in University of North Dakota, has 180 students in an active learning classroom, and there are massive pillars throughout this room. I mean, it's really got a lot of things that you have to fight with. And I did a whole day faculty development workshop with about 80 people or 90 people in this space, and it was really interesting. It's very interesting you sort of feel like you're kind of manning this ginormous ship that's moving around. But it's really interesting to look at collaboration with that many people and moving them around. And there's a lot of evidence that you can scale up the size of some of these active learning spaces because the relationship that the students have is not instructor-student ratio, but rather the table ratio. So when you have 8 people at a table, it feels like an 8-person group. It doesn't feel like 180. It really feels a lot smaller than that. Our CyberMed facility, this is the second floor of our medical school. And here we have 3 active learning classrooms and 7 16-person small group rooms on the same room. So there's a lot of inner breakout kind of space that's here. These active learning classrooms are interesting, especially because they're curved. So that makes it really interesting to work with. But here, one of the things you notice is we've been really trying to suck a lot of the technology out of our spaces and not make it prevalent. And here you'll notice there are projectors all around this room, but they're tucked in the bulkheads, and you never know they were there. Again, 8-person spaces. This is heavily used by, I think, almost every course in our physical and occupational therapy program uses these active learning classrooms. Our medical school uses combinations of these as well. We worked a lot with them in terms of helping build and rebuild spaces in the medical school to support different types of learning, as opposed to just the lecture and just the small group. This is our brand new room we've just opened. It's 88 seats in our arts building. Again, the idea of 8 people at a table. It's a double height room. And you'll notice, again, it doesn't seem exactly the same as the others. It has that feel of being in an arts building with the wood and the big windows and things like that. And what's interesting for us, and we're very excited, is this is right in the main core of our tours. So instead of tours at our university, stopping in at the 600-seat lecture hall, which is what they've been doing, they get to stop in at something that's a little bit different as well. Again, same kind of idea, writing around the room. In this case, the projection is above, so it's above the writable glass that's there as an example. So lots of different examples of active learning classrooms that allow for different types of learning to support active learning anywhere. The last, or the third one I wanted to mention is active and collaborative teaching labs. So this is an interesting development that we've had for the last 8 or 9 years, where we've been redesigning our teaching labs at our university. And I'm not talking about the research facilities. I'm talking about these are labs being used for teaching purposes. And really taking advantage of what we know about our active learning classrooms and layouts to really rethink those wet labs and dry labs that are used for disciplines. So, for example, this is a physics dry lab, and here we have Y-shaped tables that are at counter height, and students are actually doing experiments off the edge of the table. Each team that we have here has a different colored space. So every team of, there's 3 groups of 4 students at each one of the wings of the table. They have graph paper that's glass that they can work with, a writable space, and a projector. And as you look through the whole space here, there are projector spaces for faculty members, special projector spaces for students, and we can actually move the screens around the room as well. Looks kind of like an active learning classroom because it basically is. It's just at a counter height and allows them to do a lot of experiments. And if you start taking that idea and looking at other spaces, this is a physics lab where we have gas and services coming through the middle, vacuum pumps and all that sort of stuff, movable tables, which is actually really interesting. You can reconfigure this space around these columns. And then, of course, projection around the room and writing spaces all over the place so that we can have a unit of 40 students working through physics labs in a super collaborative fashion. And what's really interesting is when you discuss with faculty members about their teaching labs, nobody wants a teaching lab in rows. that you can lecture in, because nobody lectures in teaching labs, or very little. What we really want is that you want to optimize the workspace and get students to collaborate with each other, which also makes it slightly different from a research lab as well. In teaching labs, people are mostly working in teams. Now, it's not to say that you don't do that often in research labs, but in some research labs, there are individual experiments, students are working on different projects. In teaching labs, they're almost universally working together. Here's another example. This is actually a geography space, or a geography lab. Sorry, geology lab. I mistake geology and geography. Geology lab, where they bring the rocks out. And I imagine you probably have some of these as well. We actually designed this room so all of the storage and all of the microscopes are actually behind the screens. And there's a prep space behind there that you can't see. So what's interesting is this is a teaching lab that's actually a classroom when it's not being used as a teaching lab, because all the stuff goes away and you have a counter height classroom of 6 students in each table of 48 some odd students that can work together. This is not our current teaching lab, but I wanted to show you this picture so you would really believe me when I said that, yet we have had some really nasty looking lab spaces. This is a shot of our undergraduate chemistry lab before we did the renovation. Now this looks horrifying to the point where it's actually, I think you could use it in horror movies as examples of the evil mad scientists in the workspace that they had. So what we did in the undergraduate chemistry labs is that it so happens that they were ripping apart the building as part of a federal grant to do a lot of the infrastructure, and we sort of threw in the teaching labs at the same time and rebuilt the chemistry labs to look like this. Now, this has been one of the most amazing renovations we've done, and this we did back in 2012 for our full undergraduate chemistry. So we have like 1,800 students that go through these labs. And these labs are basically built like active learning classrooms, except they have gas and except they have all the sort of things you would do in a chemistry lab. Why are they so useful? What we have here are 3 pods, and usually have about 6 students around each pod, and a TA takes 3 of the pods. And this is, I'll show you the second picture, it's a 2-floor facility, so that what we've got are everything interconnected together. So they can run multiple experiments at a time in different corners. They can run all the same experiment if they want. You can actually broadcast to the entire facility from audio, from video as well. So you could actually do a presentation in one corner and broadcast it to everybody else. And here we have all these different areas so that you've got the instrumentation in the middle and the teaching sort of lab for the students on the side and the fume hoods around the outside. So what you get is a very open, collaborative, a great sightlines kind of space, which really promotes the kind of interaction that we want to promote. Once this renovation was done, chemistry redesigned their entire curriculum around these kind of facilities so that the types of experiments that the students were doing were really much more designed around working on discovery learning projects. So go build biodiesel fuel. That's your job, figure it out. Things like that, and these kind of labs really help do that. The last is a prototype spaces, and this is a space that we use for our workshops and we use with our faculty as a prototype space. And what's really, I think, interesting is that when you're dealing in education we rarely get labs. Like, we rarely get a place to experiment. And one of the problems with doing renovations is that we often will build something that we think is great, faculty will teach in it, but we can't really have people try something out before they do it. And that's what we've done here. And I think this is a really important step as well, that at a university, what we need to do is have prototyping spaces. We need to have spaces ready so that you don't just kind of think what the new space is going to look like. You stand around the table. In that chemistry example, we built that round chemistry table and we left it in the hallway of the building for a year. So it was there for a year, and people stood at it and they said, there's not enough storage, I don't know how we're going to work at this. So they had real concrete prototype experience with the furniture before it even showed up. And I think that's something that we've got to do more and more as possible so that we can ensure that our spaces are able to take advantage, we are being able to take advantage of the things that we're putting in our spaces. And the last is the classroom of the future. Here it is, classroom of the future. I know, it sounds crazy, doesn't it? Sound crazy? Classroom of the future? What are you talking about? This was the classroom of the future of 2012. Okay, I'll show you a more modernized version. But what's important about this classroom of the future? This classroom of the future has basic AV, nothing super complicated, just enough to get the job done. It's got writable walls everywhere. Every wall that's there has a writable surface on it, and it's got movable furniture. So a more modern version of this is this, where we have 2 sources of AV instead of 1, but basically basic AV, writable walls, movable furniture that can be used for this, or that can be used for this. That is what our standard needs to be. And that's what we've been trying to focus on, ensuring that this is the future of a lot of our spaces. We want spaces that are flexible, that enable lots of different types of teaching, and that have the basic needs to be able to make sure that you can collaborate in any space that's provided. So the last part I want to say is the big question, which are these rooms worth it? Is anybody sort of thinking that? Is everything worth it? All the money that we're spending worth it? I'm going to talk about three specific studies before we get to the end here. 2 of them were done by people here in Minnesota. So I think that's something to point out, that you guys actually have done an enormous amount of research, and it probably should be J.D. Walker and Christina and a number of the others standing up here telling you, here's all the research that we've done on how successful these spaces can be. And here are some of the examples. So this is Chris Brooks, who was here for many years, looked at the impact of formal learning spaces on student learning. And again, all factors except the space is constant. Students taking the courses in these spaces outperform their peers when taking the same courses in other traditional settings. So again, evidence that it absolutely can make a difference for learning. Again, Paul Bepperl and J.D. Walker did another study about flipping and showed that you can actually do some really interesting things where you can reduce the face-to-face time and still get the same kind of outcomes if you're doing a lot of that active learning in these kind of supportive active learning environments. And the last one I want to point to is just recently in 2014, talks about active learning classrooms in a 2-year study and looked at student performance and found that the ALCs generated much more enjoyment, better engagement, amplified interaction, group activity effectiveness, and really got people to be more creative. And all of those things were connected to student learning. So it's very difficult to sort of say this room increases learning, because there's a lot of conditions that go along with that. It can increase learning, but there definitely is a lot of evidence that it can. And so, we did a whole bunch of interviews and focus groups on our end. We looked at people changing from one room to another, and did a whole bunch of documentation and research studies around that. And other evidence of impact that's out there is that, students rate experiences much more positive in active learning classrooms than any other kinds of classrooms. The outcomes are better on expected outcomes that you want to have in your courses, as well as peers outperforming each other, especially at the lower end. So students that are at risk tend to do better, et cetera. And also that instructors are doing less lecturing, which is a really good thing, and doing more interaction, which is what we want to have and what we want to support. But the really important part of this is we really have to distinguish the potential from the actual. And this is really, really critical, is that active learning spaces and active learning classrooms do not guarantee anything. They don't guarantee anything can happen right. Why? Because it all depends on you. And I think that's really one of the most important things we have to think through. When we look at the potential of our learning spaces, we can use rating systems and measurements to actually score the potential of all of our classrooms on campus. The learning space rating system is one of them, where we can actually go through and score all the different things and come up with, this is a great space, right? This is a really amazing space. But we can have an amazing space and we can use it badly, right? So along with that potential argument, we have to also look at how are we actually using it? Are we doing post-occupancy surveys, interviews, focus groups, direct observations? How are we actually using these wonderful spaces? And this is kind of that evaluation program that we want to have go with any kind of change, and something you probably want to think about as well. As you change your class, as you take advantage of these new spaces, could you document it? Is this something that you can do as action research on your own? Think about your own change in thinking. Think about what's happening with your students, and look at opportunities to publish that, because that's a really interesting source of research that you can have as well in terms of the scholarship of teaching and learning. But I want to give you an example of a car. When you talk about the Formula F1 as a good example, there's a great debate where they start arguing about, no, treaded tires, we have to put the treaded tires on, we're going to get better performance. No, flat tires, no, this kind of tweak on the engine, we're going to need to do better. This tweak on the engine, we're going to need to do better. No, we need to change the cockpit this way. So tons and tons of discussion about the actual car itself. The reality is, of course, it's a big difference if Michael Schumacher is driving this car and if I'm driving this car. And I want to make that same analogy, and I think you can see where I'm going with the classrooms, is that you can have these wonderful classrooms, and you can argue to the end of day whether having the whiteboards or not having the whiteboards, or do we want to have this kind of movable furniture, that kind of movable furniture, this kind of AV, that kind of AV, whatever those decisions are. The reality is that if you don't have the faculty members to take advantage of it, none of it matters anyways. And it's that key point that we want to think through at the end of the day. We created a whole comprehensive support program that goes with our faculty teaching in these active learning classrooms that I think that you want to think about as well, in terms of we had before and after teaching, the idea of group meetings, working with instructors, resources, etc. We had consultations. We did practicing in the room with faculty. We did email and phone support as you normally would in any classroom, job aids, etc. Observations. We would be called to classrooms for, can you just come and see? I'm going to try this new, right around the room activity, and I'm just going to get some feedback as how you think it went, as an example. My first time trying a right around the room. I've never done it. This could be really interesting. And even things like in-room tech support. So one of the things that we did that really worked very well in our new spaces is we would throw students at the problem. So we actually had a student that we hired that would sit in the room and wait. Kind of like the ambulance outside a bar idea, right? So you'd wait for something to happen, and the student would basically swoop in and solve any sort of problem that would be there. It was interesting because we had the discussion with our IT folks. Well, yeah, but there's a phone. They can just pick up the phone, they get the IT people, and they can troubleshoot it. It's like, no. We need somebody right there on site. If you're going to be trying something new and risky, you need somebody there to be able to help you through that process. And I think that's an important thing that we need to do, is that we often do not reward risk in teaching. And if we're going to be asked to take those risks, we need to make sure that the support system around that is helping all of you and helping all of your faculty moving forward. So we need to focus on high quality faculty development in high quality learning spaces. If we don't support the faculty taking advantage of these spaces, we are never going to get anywhere, and we are never going to really maximize the types of learning that we want to have happen. And I think that's the most key part where I want to end, because at the end of the day, learning spaces matter when you have instructors that can take advantage of them. And with that, I thank you.